From the Post Building in downtown North St. Louis, this is Inside City. Today I'm interviewing Brian Monheiser and Anthony Calamito, founders of GEO261. They're a consulting firm that helps companies procure work with the federal government. Brian and Anthony served in different branches of the military and later met in D.C. while working in the private sector. Hi, Brian and Anthony. Welcome to Inside City, and it's great to have you today. And you guys have a company called GEO261, specializing in geointelligence. And you've had some other podcasts where you talk about the name and whatnot. And what I really want to do is just jump into what I want to focus on today is the intelligence part of it. And so talk a little bit about how separating the signal from the noise and the intelligence, what does intelligence mean to you guys?
I'll take it first.
First off, appreciate the opportunity to be on the show.
Of course,
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you probably heard the saying, all intelligence is information, but not all information is intelligence. And that's because when you really think about it, there's a lot of data that flows around. There's more data than ever before being collected, captured, shot down from satellites in space. I think what's really interesting is how you begin to understand what's the needle in that haystack. How do you begin to understand what is it you're going to pull out that's useful and, most importantly, actionable? In the intelligence community, we typically use the term actionable intelligence, things that people can actually make decisions on. And so the key is to try and find a way to sift out, right, the needle from the haystack, find the things that are going to actually allow you to make a decision and make a decision effectively. You might have heard the term right of boom, or getting inside the enemy's decision cycle. You want to be able to get that information out and act on it before something bad happens.
Because there is just a lot of noise right now. I mean, it's,
tons of it.
And so I think in a previous podcast, you talked about maybe eliminating the hay and just going straight, finding the needles, if that's even possible.
Yeah, that's the direction that everyone's going. There's so much data now that if you just took all the data and you had eyes looking at that, there's no way you'd ever be able to sift through all of it. So how do you get to the point where it's telling you what to look at versus you looking for the things you're trying to find? So,
I mean, the petabytes, zettabytes of data we're collecting every day from all the information sensors that we have, it would be literally impossible for the 10, 15,000 analysts that the intelligence community has to go through all that in a meaningful way. And so obviously we've heard a lot about machine learning and artificial intelligence and computer vision, and all these technologies are there to help aid pulling out what's really important and sifting the signal from the noise.
And we're just starting on that, the AI thing, which is very much kind of overused. It seems like we're at the beginning of whatever that is. But let's take something like Planet, which I think has enough satellites and takes literally a picture of the Earth every day as it goes around. And then you think about, well, how much that's so much information right now. And they've been doing that for, 7 years or something like that. And so is AI actively getting involved in helping to sift through some of this, or is it still just, that's a buzzword? And
I think one thing that's really interesting, you can talk about something like Planet getting the entire Earth in a day. In some parts of the globe, and I might be a little off on my numbers, it's like 10 to 13 times a day that they're collecting specific spots on the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like you just got every piece of the Earth once a day. You got every piece of the Earth sometimes 10, 12, 13 times a day in certain parts of the world.
Would that be something like in the Ukraine or North Korea or one of those geopolitical things?
It has to do with the constellation where it's flying in its time of orbit.
I see.
It's based on the availability of the satellite over that area. What's really interesting though is when you think about now how much they're collecting in a day, it's even more important to find companies that you can partner with or to create your own capabilities where you can actually find things off the imagery. Mm-hmm. Using AI, using machine learning, so that you get some, like a pile of data that it says, you don't have to look at all of the imagery, you don't have to look at all the pixels, but now start paying attention to all these things that we saw, some abnormal, thing that shows up. We see something's moved, we see something shifted. They're using technology now to help understand how those changes have happened over time, mm-hmm. and then alert different users on when and how to go look at that stuff.
Because I guess that would be one thing AI could help with is the change, right? Because it'd be very tedious to go day in, day out, or the other one might be climate, something that doesn't change very much day in, day out, but over time that could be fairly useful.
What's even more interesting is, over the last 20, 30 years, we've had a relatively easy job of just looking at land mass and looking at land mass for change and for operations and things that are happening. But increasingly now we're having to cover the oceans, right? The maritime domain. And that's just exacerbated and multiplied exponentially the amount of surface area that we have to actually watch out for.
I see. So you've got the GeoN conference, which was in Orlando a couple of weeks ago. What struck me about that was how much the interrelationship between the private sector and the federal government, because it just seems like, oh, well, the federal government's doing all this. You guys are in the private sector formerly, in the military. And so that intersection, or how those two overlap, was actually surprising a little bit to me, of just how much of like the private sector helps the federal government get data and work in that field. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it really is a partnership that I don't think advancing technology and advancing tradecraft and advancing what we want to do, I don't think it happens without those partnerships. I mean, it even goes all the way back to academia, right? There's those same relationships that you see with the different industry partners. They're happening with academia. They're happening with government. All those things are kind of interconnected to make this thing work. What's even really interesting too is those organizations tend to move faster, or able to move faster than even the government can. So are they getting out, kind of getting ahead, testing, building, creating? It really is a true partnership.
Or placing scientists, for example, or data scientists in the field.
Sure.
Those types of things.
Or even creating things you hear about a CRADA, right? Which is a combined research and development agreement. Without those things, and that's where government creates a partnership with another organization. It can be academic, it can be industry, but they create those partnerships where there's no exchange of money, but there's partnering on ideas and talking through things and thinking about things, testing, prototyping, really trying to figure out if they're kind of on the bleeding edge of what's going to be next. And so, like I said, it really is a valuable partnership.
And these relationships go back decades. You might have heard the term FFRDCs, or federally funded research and development centers. Think tanks is another word for them. But they're really quasi-government entities that have a special partnership. And while they are independent companies in industry, their quasi-government relationship allows them to think or act or make certain decisions on behalf of the government, given their standing in the market. And they've provided everything from strategic research on our engagement with certain countries around the world, to making and helping to make decisions on what type of technology the government should move forward on, for big picture things like the F-35 fighter, to small things like what equipment soldiers should carry around in the field.
It seems like in a lot of ways the the military has led the way on this, with things like the GPS satellites a generation or more ago, and now that's getting privatized. And where you have that intersection then with the commercialization of it, and to the degree that some of this is defense related, but then we all benefit because on our cell phones now we all have location services and whatnot. Do you see that trend continuing, or just changing, or how do you see that going?
If you look at probably almost any podcast or interview or engagement I've had with folks, when I got in the Marine Corps, so we're talking 1998, there was a time when it felt like we were the only persons that knew or understood this kind of industry, right? Why did it matter? How did it matter? How did you use it? And Anthony and I talk about this all the time. I really do think that it was a combination of smartphones start coming along, right? More people learn stuff about the technology, starts to become more accessible to people. You have companies like Esri, who have been the leader in this since the beginning of time and still are today. You saw Google Earth emerge. Everyone had MapQuest for the first time. All these things started coming along where people were like, wow, I didn't realize that I could. And I don't think they even thought they were doing things that had to do with geography or GIS or the geospatial sciences. They just realized I could get from point A to point B, or I can learn something about this, or I can find something in close proximity, because the devices they were holding in their hands made that work. And I think it just keeps getting bigger and stronger and faster, now to the point where you see your kids on Snapchat, right? And they're looking at a snap map. They've got all their friends, and their friends change the outfit they're wearing to tell you that they're at some type of event, right? But it's become so Anthony always talks, it's so ordinary now because everybody has it on their phone. I can only see it getting further and faster. But I think in the process of doing that, we're going to have to get folks educated up on how any of that stuff even really works.
What's really amazing is, Brian's right. I always say all the time, geography is becoming ordinary. The fact that we have the entire globe on our phone is just, it's amazing, right? What people don't realize is, when you ask your map app of choice to get you from here to the local coffee shop, there's actually a lot of geography that's going on behind the scenes. It's got to geolocate the actual shop you're trying to get to. It's got to do a least cost path to route you. Then it's got to give you turn-by-turn directions. There's all sorts of things going on there that we just don't really think about. The beauty is you don't have to. We've made geography so ordinary now, we can utilize it in all shapes and forms. The challenge, I think, for our community, for the geospatial community at large, is how do you continue to tell the story of that relevancy in an everyday way that people can relate to? It's one thing when the military uses geography to route troops and planes and do logistical things. It's another thing entirely when you have UPS and FedEx trying to do last tactical mile delivery and things like that. Those types of use cases not everybody understands or knows about. So how does this community continually push innovative uses of geography in ways that people will interact with and understand on a daily basis? I think that's the challenge.
I'll add in one piece of that too. It's understand, but it's appreciate.
Yeah.
Right. I think people understand that it's kind of working, but do they appreciate everything that went into making that work and how complex it really is?
And so I think of you guys as a geo-evangelist, if that's a word, geo-evangelist. And so really starting to, because it has become so ordinary, and this really leads into the idea of the technical aspects of it, a geoscientist or data science, and making it a career path or something that we've talked about is, do kids even know that this exists or what's involved? And so start geo-evangelizing and talking about careers and what that can be and between data science and geoscience and GIS.
I would take that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I've been privileged to be an adjunct at George Mason for 8 years. I still participate on the board at NC State University Center for Geospatial Analytics. We're constantly trying to find ways to promote geography and the geosciences to not just college students, but down to the high school level and even K through 8. I mentioned a little while ago, geography's become such an ordinary part of our lives. I think the job is easier to do now, right? You can get kids involved in mapping out their school and the playground area and teaching them the relationships and things like that. But I think longer term, we need to make sure that we carry that forward into all of the STEM programs at the K through 8 level, into the high school level. We need to start exposing students to the types of jobs they could do, everything from surveying with handheld GPS units to, agriculture, precision agriculture, and everything in between. And so I think it truly is, as great as it is that geography's become ordinary, and as awesome as it is that it is a part of our everyday lives, I think we do have to make it a point to show children what opportunities that opens up for them in the future. And I think that's, a lot of the work that we've done behind the scenes. There's
an incredible woman named Dee Jordan, who you've met, Dr. Dee Jordan. She gave me a stat recently that I guess 17 states in the United States, something in that neighborhood, require geography as part of their K through 12 curriculum. Well, that's a real problem, right? When way more than half our states don't. So how do you get people introduced to it? It's also realizing all the different things you could do inside that career, right? Everything from, you can be an engineer, you could be a salesperson, you could be a marketing lead. There's all these different careers inside of that space as well too. So it doesn't just have to be the really hardcore science engineering type things. But I think the other one thing that would be interesting is to start finding ways to create programs that will inform people so they can learn. Anthony and I, almost every time we meet somebody, go, how'd you get into this? You should have asked that at Geo. It would have been funny if you just walked around and go, hey, Baba, how'd you get into this? And almost every single time, I just ran into a guy at a happy hour. And then I said, where are you going next? He's like, I'm going to this thing for geographers. And you want to come along? It's free beer. The guy goes along and he gets kind of interested and finds out the local university's got a program and then changes his major. And all of a sudden he's now in this career field. Everybody that I've met in the military, that was by accident, right? Would you like, when I was in the Marine Corps, they asked, how do you feel about doing geospatial intelligence? I was like, I don't even know what that is.
Right.
And they're like, and my senior drill instructor is standing there as this dialogue is happening. He goes, he'll take it. So my career was picked for me, right, in boot camp. But almost everybody I've run into, it's completely happened by accident, right? They kind of fell into it. I don't know of anybody who was dreaming of maps and cartography and how they would apply the geospatial sciences. I don't know that I've run into a single person that said that in my entire career.
What is cool, though, is we're starting to see some major changes in the educational system. For example, about 8 years ago, the first AP human geography course was created and blessed by the college.
So talk more about what that would involve.
Yeah. So 8 years ago, a bunch of geography teachers got together and said, look, we need to be promoting geography education as part of the high school curriculum. And one of the ways they could encourage students to take those courses was to make it an AP course so college credit could be issued as a result. That's grown. While the technical class is human geography is obviously one aspect of geography. There's physical geography and climatology and all these other things. What we see from that is this broader understanding of the importance of geospatial education and this idea that we need to make sure it's a part of what we do in all curriculums going forward. And so that did a lot to try and bring visibility to geography and realize its importance in the educational process. We hope to see that continue.
Well, and I think a lot of people just think, oh, geography, it's name your capitals and, and what country is where and all that. And to the degree that you can put a climate behind it or the human aspect or the political aspect, there's a specific program that you guys have talked about before, the youth mappers and the youth maptivists. And talk more about, the youth mappers is a worldwide thing with different chapters. Youth Maptivists is a new thing with the American Geographical Society starting and tying that into school and that education. So talk a little bit about those programs.
Well, I think, first of all, the important piece is creating programs that are consumable by young minds, right? A lot of this stuff does happen at universities, and in order to get younger people to understand the value, they've created programs that make that happen. AGS, American Geographical Society, incredible organization, chock full of incredible people. I think one of the things that's important, they're looking for people to help support these things. They're looking for people to help back them. They're looking for people to help start them up. But the creation of those programs, I think, is key. I don't know what else to add to the.
Well, a lot of people have heard of OpenStreetMap. Organization's been around for many years, and it's basically its entire mission is to have an open and freely accessible map of the globe. What's amazing about it is it's crowdsourced, meaning everybody has the ability to go in and add to that map. About 10 years ago, people realized that this is a really interesting and innovative way to gain information about areas where there are natural disasters, particularly in areas of the world that we haven't mapped more recently. And so OSM as an organization, OpenStreetMap, the organization created something called HOT, or Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Teams, HOT. And these teams, after an event, say like the earthquake in Haiti in 2011, and tsunamis that hit around in Asia and things like that, they'll basically group together. They'll fill an auditorium or a school classroom of people, some kids, some older folks, some adults that just want to get involved, and they'll map out the entire area that was damaged. And that assures that they have the most accurate, most up-to-date information from which to then go put a recovery plan in place, et cetera. So these ideas of these humanitarian OpenStreetMap teams have become another way by which kids who don't need a formal education in geography can get exposed to it and really get hands-on, boots on the ground work going
and see the impact.
And seeing the impact, 100%.
The other thing too, when you map your own community, you map your own street, you're going to know more about that area than anybody who's ever going to map it, right? So the amount of information you're going to collect, the accuracy of the information you're going to collect, it's remarkable, right? It beats out everything. So if we all were mapping our own things, you're going to have the most robust data set on the planet because everybody knew as much as you could possibly know about the areas that you were collecting. So that's the other thing that makes that really interesting.
So you talked about open source and you get into an issue where a company may develop a piece of software and all the time and effort that goes into the R&D. And yet the open source, I think, is really important to the success of the program. Uh, we've talked about Phos4G in other situations and having that conference here in St. Louis at the Post. And in terms of that, a company that spends their time and resources to develop a product and still having open source so that all can benefit, is that a direction you see the industry going?
I think you'd be surprised to learn how many companies that are building a proprietary solution that some aspect of that isn't derived from open source. Right? There's some components of that already existed. They're going out there, and they're curating all those things, and they're bringing it in so they can build a really viable product that somebody would want. So it's hard to think that anybody can ever not promote the open source community for the amount of it that they use. But I think you'll also see that a lot of those companies give back to those communities as well. So there's a lot of solutions that are out there where I think the value is kind of going back and forth, but very many of those proprietary software companies are built on open source components.
Great. So I was reading about an early map during the cholera epidemic in, I think it was London.
It's Soho, part of London. Yep.
And there was a doctor there that was trying to figure out the source of it, did an overlay of where the cases were, figured out the contamination in the well. And that was 150 years ago. Now we have, COVID happens and it's now at a bigger scale. And so you get the sense of, I think before in one of the Penn State, I had released a whole series on geospatial, again, raising awareness. Early on, they knew about COVID and had identified the source of it, but it took time for people to say, yep, that's accurate data, and we accept it, and especially with a certain amount of people not accepting of that. I don't know if that's signal and noise, but as far as that information and getting it out, what are the barriers that you see that people are, we can get the data, we can even sift through it, signal through the noise. What do you see as the obstacles of people believing it or policy at that point?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. I don't know that I have a great answer, but I will say what is interesting, because of the way our world is global and the fact that we can literally fly from, Dubai to LA in the same day means that transmission of disease has become so much faster, right? It was never a problem in the 1600s when, John Snow was
1600s. I'm just off by a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
Right?
By the way, we get a picture outside that where that pump is at.
In London, every time we go.
Go. So
it's like,
if you need that as the thumbnail for your podcast,
it's our home. It's our home, right? Our Mecca.
We always go in and get a beer,
geographers.
Take a picture in front of there, and just kind of have that moment. Like, yeah,
okay,
cool plug for the John Snow pub if you're ever in
there
London.
You go.
It's a cool place. But I think the point is we've come a long way. Epidemiology was really the first use case of geospatial analysis, and here we are so many years later. It's the same challenge. What's different is the speed of transmission. Between the way we communicate, between the way we travel, the way we can get from point A to point B, things happen faster. So the challenge is, how do you inform faster? How do you put policy in place to act faster? I think that's the real challenge. I don't know that I have an answer, but I think that's the challenge.
I also don't know that there's any hard, fast rules or laws against how much information people have to share, right? I mean, data is only as good as the data that you're putting in, right? So, or the analysis is as good as the data you're putting in. So there's no way to get all that or guarantee you're going to get what you want.
I mean, at the Geography 2050, which is AGS puts on every year at Columbia. And so I went to that for a couple of days and become very aware of all the science going on and all the data that's there and things like, I remember one slide where these are the growing regions in the United States for corn and whatnot. And the expectation that it's going to shift to the north in the next X number of years. And it's just that's weather and all that. And that's just what's getting pushed. And it strikes me that this is the time for the geographers, to pull the data but then it's what do people do with it, and can it impact policy?
Mhm.
And that's the harder part, I guess.
We went on a business trip recently to Sweden, right, to visit our friends at T Carter, and we got to go on a little field trip one evening to go to a winery, right, to a vineyard, and you wouldn't normally think of the rich Swedish wines, right? But the reality is, right, the weather is changing so much now
Right.
that it's created a climate that far north that is great for growing grapes. And we were just shocked. And it's funny because I think if you told somebody that, they go, no, 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 no. But then when you talk to somebody who's grown up there their whole life, like the woman and man that owned this did, they're going, and year over year over year, decade over decade, the weather gets better and better and better and more conducive to growing grapes. And so we got to have like a real in-person experience of this. And it's really cool to see. I think that's where people start believing it. But you got to do really good storytelling of what it was like before and how it is now, or else it seems like it's just somebody's fake idea.
The other corollary to that story, because you and I are thinking the exact same thing, the people who are buying the most real estate in Sweden right now are the winemakers and producers in Champagne, France.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because basically what's happening is Champagne, the French region where Champagne is grown, is going to basically cease to exist.
Is that just weather, like water?
Because of weather, the heat and the water and the whole thing. So they're basically realizing that the southern part of Sweden is becoming the next hot zone for that type of grape to grow. Well, then it creates a whole new question. Well, if it's not grown in Champagne, is it Champagne? Like, will Champagne cease to exist? And so all of a sudden, geography plays this role in economics and policy and all these questions that nobody ever really thought of before.
Yeah, I've heard people predict the same thing with coffee beans. So the I'm probably going to say it wrong, Arabica bean that Starbucks uses gives you a very nice flavor to it, but it's a very particular plant that has to grow on hillsides in certain water conditions, and it's not something that they figured out how to like grow in a greenhouse. And so they're saying that a lot of these really good coffees may be gone in a certain number of years, like the Grand Michel banana you can't buy anymore and things like that. And that's, but I think that's the challenge of how do you get people interested and motivated and then used for political.
Well, it's funny too, right? And we've talked about this around the whole, spatial finance side of things.
Right.
If you were thinking as an investor and you're watching these changes, you may not see any return on that investment in the next 20 or 30 years. But if you're thinking about the changes and the impact, would you buy land? Just like Anthony's talking about, would you be buying land for the next 150 years or 200 years? Are you starting to adjust what you're doing for the long game?
Right.
And
thinking generationally. Yeah.
Geography would tell you that entire story.
Anthony, I've heard you say everything happens in a place, and I guess in a time and a place. And this also then brings up perhaps privacy issues, which people tend to be pretty sensitive about. And it's one thing if you say, okay, this is a bad country or a bad actor, but then you get into that gray area of people, I don't know if I would say harvesting your data, but taking that. And I don't know if you guys have an opinion about where you draw the line on privacy and information and how geography plays a role in that.
I'm the wrong person to ask. I've had a security clearance for so long and I've been part of so many data breaches. I don't even worry when someone's like, would you like to call me with your social? I'm like, no, I'll put it in email or text.
Yeah, right. You've already got it, probably, right?
I don't know. Having been in this career field and having the majority of it tied to kind of national defense related items, I just want us to all be safe, right? I want us to travel safe. I want us to live in our houses safe. So I don't get too caught up in any of that if it's not, I don't know. It's not the end of the world for me personally.
It's interesting, right? I didn't even know there was a thing called a privacy engineer. It's an actual job role.
I didn't know that either.
I was working at Mapbox a few years ago, and Mapbox is one of those countries that collects data from the SDKs and the apps that the SDKs are built in, but it's all anonymized data. It's not data that you can tie back to a certain person or a certain device. They have privacy engineers who figured out ways to aggregate and anonymize all the data that comes back to Mapbox so that they use it for general insight information. For example, traffic. We know there's so many people with apps in this general area, so we can tell the footfall traffic, how many people are how dense, right, it is during work hours or business hours, that kind of a thing. But they can't tell you that it's you, John, or me, Anthony, right? They don't know that level of specificity. And it's because they've employed privacy engineers to basically manipulate and clean the data in a way in which it can't be tied back. I think that's going to be more and more important because there's data about us everywhere all the time,
Right.
collected in so many different ways. It's not necessarily bad as long as it doesn't have any personal identifiable information or a way to tie it back to us and our patterns of life. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's a challenge that I think will continue to be worked on as we go.
Just personally, one of the things that I think is interesting is in terms of these direction, whether you're using the Apple product or the Google product, the one I use more than any is Waze because, and that's a crowdsourcing thing, right? The only reason they know is because there are other people out there who've plugged into the program. They know how fast they're going. They know where the traffic jams are. But then they will have things like report a stalled car. They'll report where police are, things like that. And it works because the people all crowdsource it and so I think that's a very interesting aspect of this, and it's free. And the way they pay for it is when I stop the car, this little thing pops up that is an ad for whatever it is, Walgreens or whatever around the corner. And then when I start driving, the ad goes down, and so it's a very kind of clever way to, I don't know if I would say connect people, but we all contribute to that.
Well, it's also doing another thing too, which is somebody's putting that event in, right? Stalled car,
right?
Police officer. Other people are verifying that information.
Correct. Yeah.
So now it's starting to build up the strength and the confidence you have in that data, which is a really big deal, which is another one of the reasons why open source or crowdsourced data has always been kind of a touchy subject for the government, for sure. Because how can you be sure that it's correct or it's accurate, or how was it collected, who collected it? So I think even more now, getting to the point where that stuff's good. It's really good. Sometimes it's better than authoritative data sources, right? Because you get the information faster.
So we talked a lot about generalities, but let's talk more about now St. Louis, and St. Louis really planting our flag in the geospatial arena with NGA's been here since the 30s, but there's a very large facility that's getting built. So they're going to move up there in the next couple of years. We've had T-Rex has Moonshot Labs and Geosaurus Geospatial Center. Steve Stone over at the Globe has a skiff and has attracted geospatial tenants. And what else is going on in St. Louis that allows us to grow this community?
You'll find places where I've talked about it or written about it, but go down the road and there's Fort Leonard Wood, right, where the U.S. Army has a base where they train all of their all the geospatial engineers.
Yeah, not many people would know that.
No, you have USGS just down the road, right? So United States Geological Survey. They're down in Rolla, so they're not far.
No, Scott Air Force Base, I think.
You have US Transcom and SDDC over there, the Surface Deployment and Distribution Command. You're talking logistics. That's a whole geospatial problem, right? So we've had a really rich, robust group of people who are spatial thinkers or spatial consumers, if you just take those. But go take somebody like an Ameren, go take somebody like the police department. Everybody's been using geospatial technologies for a long time. You just don't know who they are. I love when people go, I don't do anything geospatial. And I go, let's open up the Esri Industries page.
Yeah.
And you open it up and it's got everything from transportation, logistics, to city planning, to healthcare. And I go, do you fall into any of these categories? And people go, oh, well, I do. I go, okay, you may not do geospatial, but geospatial is relevant in your vertical. Yeah. And that we use it in banking, we use it in insurance. People talk all the time about what a rich ag tech industry we've got going here. All of that's got geospatial tied into it too. So we've had all of these things here for years. It goes back to the education discussion that we had earlier today. People don't know how it's involved, but it is involved. And I think it becomes our responsibility to kind of bring some of those things towards the top, right, and get some attention on them. But we've been rocking it for a really long time here. I think we're starting to get more of that. I think with the investment that the Taylor family made in TGI and TGE, that's a really big deal. I think you've seen, over at UMSL, Dr. Amir has put together a lab in less than a year. I think like 13 months, where he's got augmented reality, virtual reality, which all has a geospatial tied to.
And
geospatial
they
lab.
got an UMSL camp. I mean, for
Yeah,
kids, which again may not seem like a lot, but if you get the kids interested, then the next thing
They
follows.
did one for teachers too, right?
Yeah.
Which is really awesome. So I think we've had a lot of that going on here for a really long time. It just never kind of came to light until this gigantic building is erected on the north side of town. Everybody goes, what is that? And what is it doing? And why is that important?
Well, I think what's really interesting about St. Louis in particular, right? So Missouri, just as a state, is pretty much the center of the country.
Right.
The arch, right? The whole gateway to the west as part of the westward expansion of settlers in the United States. It's geographically interesting in and of itself where it is.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about that is all the different industries that play a part in St. Louis. Yes, there's the NGA and the whole government side of things, but you're along the river, right? The fur trade led to a lot of banking and
Right.
Financial institutions. The Federal Reserve is here. Stiefel, Edward Jones has their headquarters here. So there's a ton of that industry. No surprise. There's the agriculture industry with Bayer and Monsanto and some of these other folks. So there's so many different industries here that can and should and do, in some ways, benefit from geospatial technology. It makes St. Louis a very unique place to apply a lot of innovative capability and test new ideas in a lot of different markets. And I think that makes St. Louis very interesting because of the job potential that it could create in the future.
I think it goes back when I was in the Marine Corps. I think we had something to the tune, and my Marine Corps brother and sisters can correct me. It's something in the neighborhood of 180 of us that did our job throughout the entire Marine Corps. Just 180,000 people in the Marine Corps at that time. So you're talking 1% of the entire Marine Corps did our job. Now we supported everybody, base maintenance, facilities, mission ops, the whole nine. But nobody knew what we do. I still think that's the same.
No.
If you go over to Airman, somewhere in the CTO's office, under another rock is a really incredible team of geospatial analysts, experts, engineers who have built the capabilities that are needed for them to run.
And you think about a power grid failure or something switching over, that would become hugely important.
Yep. Keeping track of your teams in the field, making sure they're safe. How fast did they get a job done? Are they going to make it to the next job? All of those things are tied. So there's a group in that building that's doing some extraordinary work. And I'm sure very few people know the value of what they bring. But if all of a sudden all of those dashboards and apps and things stopped working, keeping track or running, everybody would lose their minds. But there's a lot of that everywhere in a lot of businesses. Because I think it goes back to that small percentage of people that do it within a larger organization. It's just part of business, right? People get accustomed to that being part of the business. I don't know if they know those people are there, but I promise you they're in every single company. They're hiding, whether it's one person or whether it's 3 or whether it's 30, they're all hiding around here.
Well, and I think the industry application is something that is easy to understand. I think, Anthony, tell the story about the UPS.
Yeah. When I worked at Esri's, many years ago now, FedEx. It was actually FedEx who Jack approached and said, I'd love to teach you how geography can help you do your job. And FedEx said, yeah, okay, whatever. We'll figure it out on our own. Thanks, but no thanks. Jack said, no, I'll give the software away. I just want you to see how it can be used. And in the case of FedEx, right, just routing their deliveries, only making right-hand turns saved them a tremendous amount of money on fuel costs alone, let alone maintenance and time for people to do the deliveries and things like that. So there are so many different applications. UPS, to your point earlier, uses telematics in all their vehicles. They're not only doing deliveries from a logistics standpoint, but they're also creating their own maps. And a lot of times their maps are more accurate, more up to date than anything you can get from the state because of the way construction happens and things like that. And so they realize that they can do better on-demand pickups and on-demand deliveries by owning their data and making their own sort of copy of the data that they can use on the way. So it's amazing what can be done. It goes back to the very first thing we talked about, which is there's more data collected than we could possibly ever deal with as humans. And it comes back to the point that we're in such a critical time in our industry where machine learning and computer vision and things like that are going to have to play a central role in order for people and organizations to gain the benefit they need from the data.
Can you imagine back in the day when we couldn't look at how many stops away your Amazon delivery was, right? I mean, that's the reality. It's 8 stops away and it should be there in 45 minutes. Like, well, I'll adjust when I leave the house because I want to be there for this.
Right.
So it's everywhere, right? I just don't think people understand
Yeah.
how powerful that is.
And you'd mentioned TGI, which is and TG or the Geo engine. And so the TGI is the research arm for the geospatial, tailored geospatial. The Geo engine would then be the industry application. And that's the thing I think it's easier to get your arms around. Yeah, looking at my phone or, hey, when's the repairman going to get here? Or my Uber driver, any one of those things. And I think there's an open house, I think tomorrow, that TGI is having. And I guess that's a way that people can start to get involved, right? Because I think you get that question a lot. What can I do? How can I jump into this? And, either being, you could try to influence curriculum or get something involved, but are there just tangible ways that people can, because I know you get that question a lot.
Yeah, I think there's a million ways to get involved. One of the things that's really interesting, there are resources to find all of the things that are available or who's doing what or when they're doing it or what educational programs. One of the things I'd love to see us do is start to consolidate some of those things. So you knew that when you came into a space and you were looking to learn more, here's where somebody's already built this, and here's where somebody's working on one of those, and here's what this group does. I think there's countless ways to get involved. TGI is going to be critically important to the success of St. Louis, as well as TGE. But I think there's a lot of other factors into that too.
Mm-hmm.
Who's contributing? How are they contributing? What are they contributing? How are we deduplicating efforts? I think a lot of that's going to come up, but there's a whole lot of opportunity. We just have to figure out what that is, and folks have to realize how broad and deep that is, because there's a lot of it.
I think what's really cool too is you have nationwide organizations like you mentioned, the American Geographical Society at the top of the podcast. They've been around for 200 years, and they're while they're based in New York, the idea is that they want to, for the whole country, be a resource where people can go to learn, to get involved, to donate, to connect. Right? They're a giant cross pollinator for things that are geospatial. There are a couple other organizations that are like that. And I think that's where we have to start. Find those key connector organizations, get involved with them, and use those as a conduit to all the other resources that are out there.
No, it's great. Well, we're coming down to a close here. I don't know if you have any final comments, or if I were to ask what the future looks like over the next 10 or 20 years. I mean, no one could have necessarily predicted that we'd all have these phones and all that. But any closing remarks?
I think the future is unlimited. I watch autonomous vehicles now and I go, I don't know what's going to happen. I argue with my kid about asking, hey, Siri, a question. I go, that's lazy. And he goes, that's kind of why they invented the technology. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I think that the potential is unlimited. And so I'm certainly excited.
So WALL-E, the lazy Americans, they don't say they're Americans in WALL-E, but that bring everything to me.
Right. Yeah.
I think the only thing I would say is I think we're due for a renaissance of information intelligence from the data we've been collecting for 50 years. I think, again, we're limited by our brains and the amount of people that exist on Earth. I think when you start bringing AI to the fray, I think we're going to start to find a ton of things that we just didn't think or know before. Couple that with, there are more modalities now for collecting information than there ever was before. Not just satellites, but small satellites that look at different wavelengths and thermal. And there's just a plethora of new capabilities that are collecting. So between the collection of data and new methods to analyze that data, I think we're due for a renaissance of a lot more information we didn't know before.
It's also an opportunity to go back and look at all that data and try to find things that happened when something else had happened, so that you can find patterns, right? To maybe learn things that we didn't see during moments in time that we could be prepared for and help avoid in the future, right? The good and the bad.
Yeah, right. It's great. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for giving us a few minutes.
For sure.